The first bat strike landed with the dull crack of wood meeting skull. The second came faster, ribs giving way like twigs snapping underfoot, and the sharp copper taste of blood filled the air thick enough to coat the throat. By the third blow, Alfred Alfonso stopped trying to block and started counting the seconds until his heart gave out in the rain-soaked gutter where even the rats knew better than to watch. "That's enough." The words didn't shout, didn't plead. They simply existed, calm and final in a way that made 6 men in tailored suits pause mid-swing and turn their heads toward the mouth of the alley, where an old woman stood half collapsed against the brick wall and half lit by the dying street lamp. Her thrift store jacket too worn for winter, her breath fogging in bursts like she'd been walking for miles. Plastic shopping bag dangling from one wrist like it held the last thing in the world worth carrying. Cassandra Callahan was 62, bone-tired from volunteering at St. Michael's Soup Kitchen and 3 years of searching for a son the city had swallowed whole. Poor enough that her pockets held loose change and a crumpled photo, desperate enough to keep her dead husband's brass Zippo lighter clenched in her palm like a rosary. And still she didn't turn away when the tallest of them grinned and took 2 slow steps forward, rolling his shoulders like he could break her with a look. "Walk away, Grandma," he said, dragging the word like a threat. "You don't want to end up bleeding next to this piece of shit." He drove his boot into Alfred's spine, and the man's face slammed into the wet pavement with a sound that made the alley itself seem to hold its breath. The victim wasn't some random mark who'd stumbled into the wrong neighborhood. It was Alfred Alfonso, the kind of name that made city councilmen sweat and rival families vanish into the river before dawn. A man with mansions, offshore accounts, and enough legal protection to make prosecutors retire early. But in this alley, power didn't negotiate. Money didn't buy mercy. There was only the ragged wheeze of punctured lungs, the gunmetal quiet before murder, and 6 shadows who'd been paid well to make sure he never left. Because this wasn't a robbery, it was an execution. Cassandra's thumb found the striker wheel of the Zippo, the last piece of proof that someone had once loved her enough to leave her something solid, and she made a choice that didn't feel like courage so much as necessity, because if she walked past this tonight, if she let one more broken thing stay broken, she'd never close her eyes without seeing his blood pooling in the cracks. She shifted her weight, scanned the dim security light overhead, the puddles reflecting distant car headlights, the rusted dumpster, the stack of wooden pallets, the angle of the loading dock, and the 6 men who believed fear always won. The rain had stopped by the time the patrol car pulled up, but the alley still smelled like rust and gasoline. Cassandra sat on the edge of the loading dock with a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching 2 officers photograph the scorch marks where her lighter had kissed the ground and turned 6 predators into running shadows. Alfred was gone, vanished the second the sirens wailed close enough to matter, but his blood was still there, dark pools mixing with rainwater and draining toward the sewer grate, like the city was trying to forget what it had witnessed. "Ma'am, we'll need that lighter." The younger officer held out his hand, gloved and polite, but his eyes were the kind that looked through people like her. Cassandra's fingers tightened around the brass casing, feeling the worn edges where her husband's thumb had rubbed the metal smooth over 20 years of nervous habit. She wanted to say no, wanted to ask if they understood it was the only thing she owned that proved she'd ever been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone worth remembering. Instead, she placed it in his palm and watched him seal it in a plastic evidence bag with a case number she'd never be able to afford to track. "You got ID?" She pulled the laminated card from her coat pocket. St. Michael's Shelter, resident number 447, photo taken 3 months ago when her hair was longer and her face hadn't yet learned to expect nothing. The officer glanced at it, then at her, then wrote something in his notepad that she knew meant transient, unreliable witness, probably confused. "You know the man they were beating?" "No." You know why you got involved? Because he was dying. The officer's pen stopped. He looked at her for the first time like she might be a person instead of a problem. But the moment passed, and he closed his notebook with a snap that sounded like a door locking. They left her there with a business card she couldn't call because she didn't own a phone, and a warning to stay available for follow-up questions she knew would never come. By the time she stood and let the blanket fall, the alley was empty except for the yellow tape and the chalk marks where Alfred's body had been. She didn't see him step out from behind the dumpster until his voice came low and final in the dark. They saw your face. Alfred leaned against the brick, one hand pressed to his ribs, his shirt black with blood that hadn't come from the rain. His eyes were cold and clear despite the beating, the kind of eyes that calculated deaths and paid them in full. Constantine's men don't forget witnesses, neither does anyone who wants me dead. He straightened, wincing but standing, like a man who'd been broken before and knew how to keep walking. You saved my life, Cassandra Callahan. That means you're in this now, whether you want to be or not. The boarding house on Elm Street smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. The kind of place where the landlord took cash and didn't ask questions as long as you paid by the 5th of the month. Cassandra climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight like the building itself was tired of holding people up. Her room was on the 3rd floor, number 12, with a window that overlooked the bus depot and a radiator that only worked when it felt like it. The eviction notice was taped to her door. She read it twice, the words blurring together. 30 days, failure to pay, legal action pending, and felt the familiar hollow ache settle behind her ribs where hope used to live. $300 she didn't have. $300 between her and sleeping in the shelter queue with the men who shouted at ghosts and the women who'd stopped shouting years ago. Inside, her room looked smaller than she remembered. A cot with a thin blanket, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, a cardboard box that held everything she owned, 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush missing half its teeth, and the photograph of Liam she'd stared at so many times his face had started to feel like a stranger's. She was folding the eviction notice into her pocket when someone knocked. "Cassandra?" The voice came through the door, quiet and ragged. "It's me, Ricky." She opened it to find Ricky Tavares leaning against the frame, skinny and twitching, eyes darting down the hallway like he expected someone to grab him from behind. He worked the streets near the soup kitchen, trading information for whatever kept him warm at night, and she'd slipped him a sandwich once when he looked too hungry to stand. "I heard something about your boy." He licked his cracked lips, hands shaking. "Liam. Someone saw him 3 weeks ago at the Red Line station, talking to a guy in a Volkov crew jacket." The air left her lungs in a rush. "You're sure?" "Lady who cleans the platform. She's solid. Said he looked older, but it was him. Same scar over his left eye from that bike accident." Cassandra's hand found the door frame to steady herself. 3 years of searching, and here it was, handed to her in a hallway that smelled like failure. Where is she now? Works the evening shift, station manager's office, asked for Gloria. She pressed $5 into her palm, money she couldn't spare but owed anyway, and watched him disappear down the stairs like smoke. 20 minutes later, she stood at the bus stop, pulling her coat tight against the wind, and didn't notice the black sedan idling across the street until it was too late. 2 men sat in the front seat, watching her through tinted glass with the kind of patience that came from being paid to follow, to wait, to report back to someone who collected faces and filed them under loose ends. The bus came, and she climbed on, and the sedan pulled into traffic 3 cars behind, silent as a shadow that had learned her shape.
The sedan cut her off 3 blocks from the Red Line station, wheels screaming as it jumped the curb and forced her back against a brick wall of a shuttered grocery store. 2 men stepped out, moving with the efficient calm of people who'd done this before, and Cassandra knew with sudden clarity that she wouldn't make it to Gloria, wouldn't find Liam, wouldn't see another sunrise unless someone decided her life was worth the trouble of saving. Then a second car arrived, sleek and black and expensive, and the men froze. Alfred stepped out like he owned the street, flanked by two others who carried themselves like weapons waiting to be drawn. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. The men from the sedan looked at each other, calculated odds they didn't like, and climbed back into their car. It pulled away slow, a promise written in the brake lights that this wasn't finished. "Get in," Alfred said, holding the door open. She didn't argue. The drive took 40 minutes through neighborhoods that got cleaner the farther they went, past manicured lawns and iron gates, and houses where poverty was something you watched on the news. Alfred's estate sat at the end of a private road, surrounded by walls high enough to blot out the sky, and cameras that tracked every angle like mechanical eyes that never blinked. Inside, the air tasted filtered, sterile and cold, the kind of place where even the silence had been scrubbed of anything messy or human. A woman in a black suit appeared and led Cassandra through marble hallways to a guest room with a bed bigger than her boarding house and windows that didn't open. "You're safe here," Alfred said from the doorway, though the word safe felt like a lie wrapped in expensive furniture. "Constantine's people won't touch you inside these walls. I didn't ask to be here. You stopped asking for things the moment you lit that fire." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that sounded like a lock. "This is my world, Cassandra. The rules are simple. Loyalty above law, silence above truth, survival above everything else. You follow them, you live. You break them, and I can't help you." She met his eyes, searching for the man she'd saved in the alley, but found only cold calculation staring back. "What about finding my son?" "That's why you're still breathing." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and placed it on the dresser. "Your boy's name came up in one of my ledgers 6 months ago. Constantine used him to move product through the north side. If you want answers, you stay here, you stay quiet, and you let me handle this my way. And if I don't, then you walk out that gate and see how far you get before they finish what they started." He turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Welcome to the fortress, Cassandra. Even the air here is filtered for lies."
Alfred's office sat on the second floor, behind a door that required 3 separate key codes and a thumbprint scanner that glowed red until it recognized him. Inside, the walls were lined with monitors showing every corner of the estate, and a massive desk held computers that hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines that never slept. He gestured to a chair across from him, leather and expensive, the kind that swallowed you whole if you weren't careful. "Constantine didn't try to kill me because he's ambitious," Alfred said, pulling up files on a screen that faced them both. "He tried because someone gave him permission, someone who needed me gone to consolidate their own power." The screen filled with rows of numbers, dates, wire transfers, shell companies with names that sounded legitimate until you looked closer and saw the rot underneath. Cassandra leaned forward, squinting at figures that blurred together. Hundreds of thousands, then millions, moving through accounts in patterns that suggested choreography rather than chaos. "Senator Reginald Thorne," Alfred tapped a name highlighted in red. "Campaign Finance Chairman, Infrastructure Oversight Committee, and the cleanest-looking criminal you'll ever meet. He's been taking kickbacks from Constantine for 2 years, using city contracts to launder money through construction projects that never finish and consulting firms that don't consult. Why are you showing me this? Because you're in it now, whether you want to be or not. And because," he scrolled down, past more names and numbers, until he stopped on a section marked with her son's initials. "Liam's name appears here." Her breath caught. There it was, typed in a font that made it look official and bloodless. L. Callahan, Courier, North Side Distribution, active until 18 months ago. But the details were grayed out, locked behind an encryption key she didn't have. "What does it say?" Her voice came out raw, stripped of everything except need. "That's leverage," Alfred closed the file with a keystroke that felt like a door slamming. Information I keep until I know I can trust you completely, until I know you won't take what you learn and run to the first honest cop you find. You're holding my son hostage. I'm keeping you alive. He stood, buttoning his jacket with movements so controlled they might have been rehearsed. Thorne and Constantine both want you dead because you're a witness. The ledger proves their connection, but it also proves that your boy was in deep with people who don't let you quit. If you want the truth, you earn it by helping me bring them down. Cassandra stared at the blank screen where her son's name had been, feeling the weight of every choice that had led her here, to a fortress where even information came with a price. And if I refuse, then you leave here with nothing but questions that'll eat you alive until Constantine's men finish the job. Alfred walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. Your son's story is in that file, Cassandra. Whether you get to read it depends on what you're willing to do next. The call came on the third day, patched through Alfred's security line to the phone they'd placed in her room, a burner with only 2 numbers programmed in. The voice on the other end was young, female, uncertain in a way that made it feel real. Is this Cassandra Callahan? I saw the flyer about Liam. I know where he is. Cassandra's hand tightened around the phone, pulse hammering in her throat. Where? The old Riverside textile mill on Archer Avenue. He's been squatting there with some others. I volunteer at the Needle Exchange. Saw him 2 days ago. He looks rough, but it's definitely him. The line went dead before she could ask more. She found Yuri Dragomir in the kitchen, a brick wall of a man with scarred knuckles and eyes that had stopped being surprised by violence decades ago. Alfred had assigned him to shadow her, a leash disguised as protection. She told him about the call, watched him process the information with the flat expression of someone who'd heard every lie the world could tell. It's a sit-up, he said, in an accent that turned consonants into gravel. You don't know that? I know Constantine. I know how he baits hooks. But he was already reaching for his keys, resignation settling over his features like armor. We go, we leave at first sign of trouble. You follow my lead or I drag you out. Understood? The mill squatted on the edge of the industrial district like a tombstone for forgotten labor, windows shattered and walls tagged with graffiti that had faded to ghosts. They parked a block away, and Yuri moved ahead of her through the loading dock entrance, one hand hovering near his waist where the gun lived under his jacket. Inside smelled like rot and rust and something chemical that burned the back of her throat. Cassandra called Liam's name into the darkness, her voice swallowed by the cathedral-high ceilings and machinery that hadn't moved in 20 years. The first shot came from above, punching through a rusted beam inches from Yuri's head. He grabbed Cassandra and yanked her behind a concrete pillar as 3 more shots cracked through the air, ricocheting off metal with sounds like angry hornets. Footsteps echoed from the catwalks, multiple sets, coordinated, closing in. Trap, Yuri said, calm as someone ordering coffee. He returned fire twice, buying them seconds as he pulled her toward a service corridor. Move. They ran through hallways lined with stripped electrical panels and offices gutted down to concrete, bullets chasing them like punctuation marks on sentences they'd never finish. Yuri kicked through an emergency exit, and they spilled into an alley where his car was already rolling up, driven by another of Alfred's men who'd been watching the perimeter. Cassandra collapsed into the back seat, lungs burning, and watched the mill recede through the rear window. Somewhere inside that trap, Constantine's people were laughing, having confirmed exactly how desperate she was, and how easy it would be to use that desperation to kill her. Alfred didn't speak to her for 2 days after the mill. She existed in the guest room like a ghost haunting someone else's mansion, eating meals brought by silent staff and staring at walls that cost more than her entire life. On the 3rd morning, he appeared at her door with car keys and an address written on hotel stationery. Your street informant, Ricky, he's willing to talk again, says he has something real this time. Alfred's expression was unreadable. Yuri will drive you to the Greyhound depot downtown. Meet him at the ticket counter at 2. She should have known better, should have learned from the textile mill that hope was a weapon people used against you. But the need to know burned hotter than caution, so she went. The bus depot sprawled across 3 city blocks, a cathedral of departures filled with people running toward something or away from everything. Cassandra found Ricky near the ticket counter, thinner than before, eyes darting like trapped birds. He started to speak, then his gaze locked on something behind her and his face went pale. "Run," he whispered. She turned and saw them, 3 men in dark coats moving through the crowd with the focused intent of predators who'd spotted prey. Cassandra grabbed Ricky's arm and pulled him toward the exit, but they were already cutting off the angles, herding them toward the back corridors where security cameras had blind spots and screams got swallowed by diesel engines. The first shot came as Yuri's car screeched into the loading zone. He was out before the wheels stopped, firing twice to scatter the enforcers, shouting for Cassandra to get down. She dropped, pulling Ricky with her, but he was too slow, or too scared, or too used to running alone. The bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him sideways into a bench. He was 19, maybe 20, with acne scars and a mother somewhere who'd stopped expecting him home. He died before the ambulance arrived, blood pooling on concrete that had seen too much of it to care anymore. Yuri got her into the car as sirens wailed closer, and they were gone before the first squad car arrived. Back at the estate, Cassandra found Alfred in his office and didn't bother knocking. "Tell me what happened to Liam, all of it, right now." He looked up from his desk, something almost like sympathy crossing his face before discipline erased it. "The truth will cost more than you want to pay, Cassandra. A boy died today because I'm chasing ghosts. I need to know if my son is one of them." Alfred was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file folder, setting it between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Then sit down, because once you read this, there's no unknowing it." The file stayed closed on Alfred's desk for 3 hours while Cassandra sat in her room and tried to convince herself she was ready to read it. She wasn't. She knew she'd never be. But the not knowing had carved out so much space inside her that there was barely anything left to protect. She was reaching for the folder when someone knocked, not the polite tap of a state staff, but a harder, official sound that carried authority. A woman in a navy blazer appeared in the doorway, flanked by Yuri, who looked deeply unhappy about her presence. "Miss Callahan? I'm Detective Sienna Marks, Major Crimes Division." She held up a badge that looked real enough to matter. "I need to speak with you, alone." Yuri didn't move. "Mr. Alfonso said no visitors." "Mr. Alfonso doesn't get a vote when a witness is being held against her will." Marks met his stare without flinching, the kind of cop who'd learned to stand her ground in rooms full of men who thought size won arguments. 5 minutes, or I come back with a warrant and enough questions to make everyone's day very long." Yuri left, but only after a glance that said he'd be listening through the door. Mark sat in the chair across from Cassandra, pulling out a tablet and swiping through photos until she found what she wanted. 3 nights ago, an apartment building on Division Street burned. Arson. 2 families displaced. 1 elderly man hospitalized for smoke inhalation. She turned the screen so Cassandra could see the charred remains of someone's home. Investigators found accelerant and your lighter at the scene. Your prints, your property, your motive. The air left Cassandra's lungs. "That's impossible. The police took my lighter the night you intervened in Alfred Alfonso's execution. I know. I pulled the evidence log. Marks leaned forward, voice dropping. Your lighter was logged into evidence at 11:47 p.m. The arson happened at 2:15 a.m. the next night. Someone checked it out of the evidence locker using falsified credentials, planted it at the scene, and returned it before morning shift noticed. Who? Someone with access to police systems and a reason to want you discredited before you could testify about what you saw in that alley. Marks closed the tablet. Senator Reginald Thorne sits on the Police Oversight Committee. He's got friends in the department who owe him favors. Cassandra felt the walls closing in, the fortress suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a cell. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been building a case against Thorne for 2 years, and you're the first witness who's still breathing. Come in, make a statement, testify, and I'll keep you safe. Stay here with Alfonso, and you're just trading one criminal for another. Mark stood, leaving a business card on the dresser. You've got 48 hours to decide which side of the law you want to die on.
Cassandra left the estate on the 4th day, walking out through the front gate while Yuri argued on the phone with Alfred about protocol and liability and a dozen other words that meant he didn't want to explain how he'd let her slip away. She took a bus to the downtown branch of the public library, a building that smelled like old paper and the kind of quiet that felt sacred, and found a corner table where she could think without surveillance cameras tracking her pulse. Detective Mark's card sat in her pocket next to the photograph of Liam she still carried everywhere. The file Alfred had offered remained unread on his desk, locked behind walls she'd walked away from because staying meant drowning in someone else's war. She needed neutral ground, needed to remember what it felt like to exist without permission. She was reading a newspaper someone had left behind when the man sat down across from her. He wore a suit that cost more than her year's rent, silver hair combed with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was armor. His smile was warm and empty, the kind politicians practiced in mirrors until it looked genuine. Cassandra Callahan. May I call you Cassandra? He didn't wait for an answer. I'm Senator Reginald Thorne. I believe we have mutual friends who've caused us both considerable trouble. She started to stand, but his hand moved across the table, not touching her, just occupying the space between them like a barrier. Please sit. This will only take a moment. Around them, people read and studied and existed in their own bubbles of normalcy, unaware that something cold and vicious was happening 3 feet away, disguised as a polite conversation. You saw something you shouldn't have, Thorne continued, voice low and reasonable, and you made choices that put you in a very precarious position. Mental health services in this city are stretched thin, but I sit on the Appropriations Committee. One signature and you're remanded to state psychiatric care for evaluation. 72 hours becomes indefinite when the doctors find you incompetent. No visitors, no phone calls, no one even remembering your name. Cassandra's hand found her phone in her coat pocket, the cheap burner she'd bought at a corner store with her last $20. Her thumb found the record button by muscle memory, pressing it without looking. Or, Thorne said, leaning back like he'd already won, you forget what you saw in that alley. You tell Detective Marks you were confused, traumatized, unreliable, and you disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of while people who matter clean up this mess. And if I don't? His smile never wavered. Then you'll spend the rest of your life in a facility where they medicate you until you can't remember your own son's name, which would be tragic considering Liam tried so hard to get clean before Constantine's people. He stopped, reconsidered. But that's not relevant, is it? She kept recording for another 30 seconds after he stood and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the library like a countdown she couldn't stop. The grand jury room sat on the 4th floor of the criminal courts building,
Windowless and fluorescent bright, with 17 citizens who'd been pulled from their ordinary lives to decide if extraordinary crimes deserved prosecution. Cassandra sat at the witness table with Detective Marks beside her, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, calculating whether she looked credible or crazy. Senator Thorne sat 3 rows back with his attorney, a man whose billable hours could fund a small country. He met her gaze once, briefly, and she watched him recalculate when he saw she wasn't shaking. The prosecutor, a woman named Chen, with gray in her hair and fire in her questions, held up the evidence bag containing the brass Zippo. "Miss Callahan, can you identify this? It's my lighter, my husband's, before he died. And on the night of March 14th, police confiscated it as evidence at the scene where you witnessed an assault on Alfred Alfonso. Is that correct?" "Yes." Chen turned to the jury. "This lighter was logged into police evidence at 11:47 p.m. on March 14th. At 2:15 a.m. on March 15th, an apartment building burned. Arson investigators found this same lighter at the scene, suggesting Miss Callahan was involved." She paused, letting the timeline settle. "But the evidence log shows something interesting." Detective Marks stood, placing documents on the overhead projector, digital timestamps, security footage, chain of custody forms with signatures that didn't match handwriting samples. Someone accessed the evidence locker using credentials belonging to Officer Dale Brennan, who was on vacation in Florida. The lighter was checked out, planted at the arson scene, and returned within 6 hours. Officer Brennan's access card was cloned using equipment that requires departmental authorization. "And who authorized that equipment?" Chen asked, though everyone in the room already knew. "The Police Oversight Committee, chaired by Senator Thorne." The murmur that went through the room sounded like thunder building. Chen played the library recording next, Thorne's voice filling the speakers with threats polished smooth by years of practice. When it finished, 2 federal marshals stood from the back row and moved toward where Thorne sat, frozen, his attorney already reaching for a phone that wouldn't save him. They arrested him in the hallway, cameras flashing as he was led away in handcuffs that looked obscene against his expensive suit. Cassandra found Alfred waiting outside in a car that cost more than her life. He handed her the file without ceremony, and this time she opened it. "Liam Callahan, deceased. Territory dispute, North Side, 18 months prior. Collateral damage." The words were clinical, bloodless, and beneath them was a photograph of her son that showed what bullets did to hope. "He was trying to leave," Alfred said quietly. "Constantine used that against him." She closed the file, feeling something inside her settle into a weight she'd carry forever. Alfred placed the evidence bag with her lighter on the seat between them, returned, cleared, and utterly useless now. "One flame can't burn away an empire." "No," Cassandra agreed, clutching the lighter like a prayer. "But it can show you what's standing in the dark." She stepped out of the car and walked into a city that hadn't changed, carrying debts that could never be repaid, only endured. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. It keeps these Mafia legends alive. Like, comment, and I'll see you in the next upload.